Church and state. Welcome to another episode of the Belt of Truth podcast. A good friend, Brother Jay, is coming with a controversial topic. I love talking about religious liberty. As you guys know, it is a theme of Bible prophecy. And there's this thing about this phrase, separation of church and state, that people's brains turn off when they hear it. So I want to open with prayer. We need to rethink historically, unemotionally, non-ideologically, biblically, constitutionally, accurately about this topic so that we can understand the signs of the times and be prepared to take the right side of prophetic history. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for my brother who's come to join in this third angel's message, this presentation of the truth of your character, your methods, and how there's a great deception and persecution coming. And Lord, these are the times that try men's souls. We know these are times that are calling us to decision. And so we just ask for a sense of the depth and the importance of the themes we will discuss about goings on in our world right now that are harbingers of prophetic fulfillment. So thank you for this time, and speak through your servant, Brother Jay, and give us all ears to hear. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you so much for having me on, Scott. Just share my screen here. All right, so like Scott said, the truth about the separation of church and state, and it's true. People hear that and they think to themselves, well, no, that's people who are in favor of a separation of church and state. Those people are the same people who want drag queen story hour. We have got to go back to God and have God in the public square and in public schools. And so they hear this and they say, well, no, that was a mistake. That's not in the Constitution. And so what we want to do is unpack the Constitution. We want to explain what the founding fathers believed. What is the secret of national greatness in America? And what is the narrative that's being promoted today from people, some people who want a union of church and state? And they want to legislate their religious beliefs in the same way that people on the left want to legislate drag queen story hour and transgenderism and climate change and gay marriage and things like that. And there's a lot of people on the right, and they've said, listen, we've had it up to here. We're finished, right? We're done with your leftism and your oppression, using government to compel basically your religion, because your fanaticism, your loyalty to these particular dogmas, left-wing dogmas, we've had it with that. And you're utilizing the power of the state. The only way to save society is for us to utilize the power of the state and to bring normalcy, and we have got to bring God back into the picture. And a lot of people have very good motivations with this, and they're looking for a solution to what has taken place: the deterioration of the family, the loss of moral value in society, the unkindness and the cruelty and the corruption and the oppression. And they're saying, where is the answer? The answer is, we've got to go back to God. Now, and of course, we should go back to God, but we should go back voluntarily. And that's really the substance of this presentation. We are going to talk about a union of church and state. I have a number of clips for you. This is the first one. This is a group of theologians here. They call themselves, that's Doug Wilson there, second from right, and he's the pastor of a church in Idaho. He's got over 200 churches across the United States, actually. He's a very influential figure, and we're going to listen to hear what they're talking about as far as the roots of America.
Yeah. It also sounds like your thoughts sound fundamentally Calvinistic.
I'm afraid so.
Guilty as charged.
But I can't help it.
George Bancroft, the historian, called John Calvin the father of America.
And that's true.
And he also said, and I quote here, "He who will not honor the memory of and respect the influence of Calvin knows but little of the origin of American liberty."
Right.
I guess my question there is, what is it about Calvinism that lends itself to this concept of American liberty and to limited government and everything we're discussing here?
The God of Calvin, I would say I'd modify it a little bit. I'd say Calvin was the grandfather of America, and John Knox was the father, because our institutions were largely mediated to us through the British Isles, and largely because of Scotland and the Westminster Confession. So there was a profound influence there, but it's all Calvinistic.
The question that I want to ask right at the outset here is that true? You've heard the assertion that America owes its liberty and the American experiment to John Calvin. Is that true? Is Calvin the father or the grandfather of America? Is that the system that makes America great? John Knox. Who is John Knox? Well, Scottish reformer. Is he the person who is the father of America? What about the founding fathers? Were they subscribers to Calvin's theology? Yeah. So the Calvinists, before we come to Pastor Joel Webb on here in this clip, the Calvinists want a union of church and state. And I'm going to talk extensively about John Calvin, but you have this pastor here, Joel Webb, who's saying what we need is to have government impose the first table of the law on society. That's a Calvinistic idea. John Calvin unified church and state in Switzerland, in Geneva specifically, and imposed his religious views on society using civil power. Is that the model that America is built on? And what are the consequences if it's not, and these guys get their way? Let's listen to Pastor Webb, and then we'll talk a little bit more here.
And then all the 10 Commandments must be legislated. What we've done is we thought the second table of the law, so second table meaning Commandments 5 through 10, the commandments of God that pertain to horizontal relationship with our neighbor, like don't steal, don't murder, these kinds of things. We think that should be legislated by the civil magistrate, but the first table of the law, that's not true. And I'm not just...
All right, so Christians, is it true that civil power can legislate the first table of the law? And you have to think about what the implications of what Joel Webb is saying, right? And what the guys who were before him, they want not just the government to say, well, stealing is wrong, we're going to punish stealing, right? We all agree that the government can use civil power to prevent stealing and punish stealing. Murder is wrong, right? It's uncivil. Government can punish murder. Nobody disagrees with that. The issue that they're proposing is that the first table of the law ought to be able to be subject to civil power, the imposition of civil laws on society. So that means that blasphemy laws are imposed by the state on society. Well, what is blasphemy? Well, if you want to know what blasphemy is, you can look back at Massachusetts. They had blasphemy laws. And if you blaspheme God or Jesus, or if you blaspheme the Sunday, the sacredness of Sunday, people don't know this, then you could be punished for blasphemy. And the first penalty was a fine. The second penalty was to have your tongue borne through with a hot poker. And that was the system which existed before Confederation in America in Massachusetts when it was a colony. So the question is, I want you to start thinking about as we go through the presentation, what does a union of church and state really look like according to what these guys want? And of course, they're not shy about saying they want blue laws as well, which are Sunday laws, because of course the Sabbath is in the first table of the 10 Commandments, not the second, right? God gives 2 tables of stone, not because he can't find a big enough rock, but because he's saying these are your obligations to your God, right? To the creator of the heavens and the earth. These are your obligations to your fellow man. And Paul in Romans chapter 13 lays down the authority of the civil power. And what he itemizes is all from the second table of the law. He never says that the civil power has the authority to impose the first table of the law. So this is the theological debate that we're going to have here. Another clip from, this one is from the New York Times, and pastor, the same pastor from Moscow, Idaho.
Give me just your definition of Christian nationalism.
Christian nationalism is the conviction that secularism is a failed experiment, that societies require a transcendent grounding in order to be able to function at all. And as a Christian, I believe that that transcendent ground should be the living God and not an idol. That would be my short form definition of Christian nationalism. Even shorter would be Christian nationalism is the conviction that we should stop making God angry.
And so that's the first purpose of your political project, for America to stop making God angry.
Yes.
What's fascinating about that, Scott, is that that's exactly what we're told in the Spirit of Prophecy is going to take place, that the call will go up. We have to go back to God, that the reason these things are taking place in the land, like the decline of influence and the decline of monetary power and the decline of the weather deteriorating and natural disasters and things like that, crime, civil unrest, is all because God is angry. And the way to fix it is to go back to God. We're told that that is going to take place. And here you have Doug Wilson making the exact same statement, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And it's sneaky too, what he said. He said Christian nationalism is the idea that, secularism has failed and we need a grounding for society. And that grounding is the living God. You and I would agree with that. Actually, a society is going to thrive. A nation is going to thrive if its grounding is upon biblical godly principles. What he didn't answer, which is deflecting from the real heart of the danger of Christian nationalism, and it's what makes it unique, is how is that achieved? How does society achieve a godly grounding? According to his ideology, it's through the sword, through the state, in part at least. And what you're teaching is it's not. It's through free choice to worship God in the first 4 commandments are one's duty to God, and it's not to be legislated or forced. So he really dodged the heart of Christian nationalism there in that it has that imposition, that dominion approach that's going to be, it requires the use of violence, doesn't it? I mean, we need to call this what it is. What did Calvin's own Geneva, Switzerland do when there was somebody with unorthodox views on the Trinity? Was executed. And like you pointed out in Massachusetts, it's like, I'm sure you're going to get to it, but the U.S. Constitution and our nation didn't adopt the Puritan Massachusetts form of government under our Constitution at all. They rejected it completely. And these guys want to go back to that, don't they?
That's right. Yeah, Jesus, this is really about the character of God. Does Christ compel? Does he want government to compel and punish using civil laws, a theocratic paradigm on society? Or does Christ say, he who comes to me, I will in no wise cast out? If you're thirsty, come drink, right? Or do you get forced to put your head in the bucket, right? Does Christ waterboard people?
Wow.
So let's talk about Calvin. Because really this theology, they're invoking Calvin. You need to know who Calvin is. They're not going to tell you all of the unsavory things about Calvin or how people hated living under his thumb. So Calvin was a French priest. He was in France and he found a copy of the Bible. And light began to shine into his mind, and he saw that the papal system was full of errors. And because he started preaching about it, he was forced to flee. And he ended up in Geneva. And he only came part of the way out. He still had all of his Romanistic ideas about the imposition of religion on society using force. And so when he comes to Geneva the first time, he taught the civil enforcement of both tables of the law. And people hated living under Calvin so much the first time he was there. They ran him out of town and he had to flee the country. And he was gone for a few years. And then they brought him back, and he was exactly as bad or worse than the first time he was there. And of course, he taught predestination, right? That Christ had only died for a certain group of people, that some people were predestined to be saved because Christ had died for them. And some people Christ did not die for, that he arbitrarily decided, well, I'm not dying for that person's sins. Therefore, that person was predestined to eternal torment. And so then you have the idea of eternal hell and that God roasts people forever and ever and ever. Calvin keeps this relic of Romanism. And he says, you are some people are predestined to burn forever. That's his theology. And he also keeps infant baptism, which is something that the Reformed Church today keeps as well, because they believe in original sin. If you're
I don't remember it, but I was baptized in a Reformed church as a baby. Sprinkled. Wasn't actually baptized. They don't immerse babies. That's what the word baptized means. But yeah, keep going.
Right. Sprinkled. Right. And so I think it's important to note here that Calvin's theology is different than Martin Luther's theology and different from William Tyndale's theology. So you have this branch of Christianity that follows John Calvin. Calvin says you have an immortal soul. That means you can be eternally tormented. William Tyndale and Martin Luther say, no, there's no such thing as the immortality of the soul, the natural immortality of the soul, that God alone is immortal. And Christ dies for everybody. He took upon himself the sins of the whole world. And so you have this divergent in Christian thought with Calvin. And that's very important because Calvin retains the union of church and state. When you see the Vatican flag, the keys of heaven and earth, they're depicted as a silver a key and a gold key. Silver key is the earth. The gold key is heaven. So you have a union of heaven and earth. The Roman Pope says, I have universal dominion over things spiritual and things temporal. And so, that's why the Roman papacy says you have a union of church and state. And of course, the Roman pontiff is both the king of the Vatican and he is the bishop of Rome and the head of the church. So moving on here, A.T. Jones, a giant of a theologian and historian, in his book, The Two Republics, excellent reading, I highly recommend it. But he says, the views of Calvin on the subject of church and state were as thoroughly theocratic as the papal system itself. So Calvin was a theocrat, and he was just like the papacy. And Jones says, he says, Augustine was his master and model throughout. When at the age of 28, at the urgent call of Pharaoh, Calvin settled in Geneva, he drew up a condensed statement of Christian doctrine, in fact, a synopsis of his institutes consisting of 21 articles, which all the citizens were called up in bunches of 10 each to profess and swear to as the confession of their faith. And so Calvin makes everybody swear that they agree to his institutes. It's sort of like Constantine marching people through the Tiber River. They go in dry pagans, they come out wet pagans, because they are forced to swear to these articles of faith as citizens, not as religious people.
It's kind of cult-like, too. It's like my institutes must be adhered to. He's the one that wrote them.
It's very cult-like. And they were not required to be church members, but simply as men and citizens, they were required to take the oath and accept this as the confession of their faith. And so Jones goes on to say, he says, when every member of the state was subject to the discipline of the church, and when this discipline was exercised exclusively by the body of preachers and elders, with Calvin at the head of that body, his power was practically unlimited. Now get this. He says, by this, it is further evident that the system there made and established by Calvin was but the papal system over again, with Calvin as the Pope.
Oh, wow. That's some strong language. Yeah, you can expect that from A.T. Jones, man. That guy's on fire. I love it.
Yeah, and so Calvin basically substitutes himself as the head of the religion. And of course, you have civil power being brought to bear against anybody who disagrees with Calvin. And so you have persecution of people. And so the first person who fell afoul of Calvin was this guy by the name of Gruet. And so Gruet was like, and some of the people were like, well, listen, we just overthrew the authority of the Pope of Rome. We're not just going to accept you as the Pope of Geneva. And Gruet starts speaking out against Calvin, and he calls him the new Pope. And he says, look, the Bible doesn't teach the immortality of the soul, which is what you're preaching. And Gruet, because he disagreed on this, he was executed at the behest of Calvin, carried out, of course, by the civil power, but in accordance with the institutes, which had the force of civil law. And again, what we're talking about here is, what does America look like if you have a union of church and state? And if the people who are invoking John Calvin and who are saying, look, Calvin is the father of America, the idea of what they think America should look like is Calvinistic. So when they say we want a union of church and state, look at the story of Gruet. He disagreed about a theocratic doctrine, a theological doctrine and paid the price with his life, which is what Revelation chapter 13 says is going to happen at the end. So back to Calvin. Another who dissented was Castalio, master of the public schools of Geneva. He attacked the doctrine of unconditional predestination. He was deposed from office and banished. And of course, these guys, they had to leave, because if they didn't leave, they'd be executed. Another one, Jerome Bolsec, a monk who had been converted to Protestantism, attacked the doctrine of absolute decrees. He was thrown into prison. After a 2 days debate with Calvin before the council, was banished. Then you got another guy, Jacques de Bourgogne, right? He was obliged to leave Geneva. And then you have the story of Servetus. And this is the story that is just spine-tingling or blood-chilling. Because you've got this guy, Michael Servetus, and he's from Spain. And Servetus was a giant for his time. He was not just a theologian, he was also a physician. He's credited with discovering and describing the circulatory system in the body that we still use today, his writings and his ideas, I should say. And Servetus is studying the Bible, and he's writing, and he's joined the Reformation, and the Pope is like, I want Servetus. Servetus is the enemy of my power. And at that point in time, the Spanish Inquisition is in full swing in Spain, and Servetus is arrested. And I think he's condemned to die at the stake, or at least he's scheduled to be brought before the Inquisition and tortured so that they can elicit a confession from him. But he escapes jail and he flees Spain. So he was a giant. He's like MacGyver. He gets away from the Pope's goons and he flees Spain. And he thinks to himself, man, I need someplace safe to go. And he's been having this dialogue with John Calvin, and they disagree about a number of things, one of which was infant baptism, one of them which was had to do with the Trinity. And I've looked into Servetus's ideas about the Trinity, and Calvin has ideas about the Trinity, and I'm not sure either Calvin or Servetus is 100% right on the Trinity. You'd have to dig down deeper on that. Anyways, there's this theological disagreement between them, but Servetus fundamentally trusts John Calvin, and so he writes to Calvin and he says, "I want to come to Geneva." And Calvin knows that Servetus is on his way and that he's fleeing the papacy, and so Calvin writes to Farel, who's his friend, secretly. He says, Servetus offers to come hither if it be agreeable to me. So he's saying Servetus is coming to me if I agree. And he says, but I'm unwilling to pledge my word for his safety. For if he shall come, I shall never permit him to depart alive, provided my authority shall be of any avail. So Calvin is premeditating the destruction of Michael Servetus, but Servetus thinks Calvin is his friend. Now, why is Calvin not his friend, but secretly his enemy? Well, it's because Servetus disagrees about infant baptism and these other theological points of doctrine. And so because of this religious dispute with Calvin, Calvin is plotting his murder. It's premeditated.
Yeah. Well, and it's state authorized though, right?
It is. It's
so. I mean, this is so old world. In America, we take for granted the freedom that we can have theological debates and even completely different religions, and nobody's like, "Oh no, but that guy's going to have power, and I'm going to be executed for having a different view of theology." That's what Christian nationalism wants. That's what these guys want, is what you were saying: blasphemy laws and a return to this sort of Geneva tyranny.
They want civil power in the same way that the left wants to enforce its dogma. And Scott, I'll go a little further. I'll tell you this, since we know about the mark of the beast and you talk about it on this channel, remind me before the end of this podcast. I won't say this right at this second, but remind me. So Servetus, he comes to Geneva, and Calvin has him arrested. Reports him to the civil authorities. They arrest him. There's a trial. He's condemned pursuant to the Institutes. He's condemned to die. And they get him and they take him into the public square and they gather green wood intentionally. So not only do they execute him, they execute him in the most barbarous, mean-spirited, Inquisition-like way. And so when you have
slow burn is what you're saying.
exactly, a slow burn, and he roasts for hours, Scott. And he's screaming and he's crying for mercy for hours and hours, and they don't help him. And Calvin, defenders of Calvin will say, well, Calvin didn't want him to burn; he wanted him to be beheaded. Well, as though that's so much better.
Right.
You want him murdered, but you want him murdered in a less cruel way than he was actually murdered. That doesn't make
by
him.
Behold, we become changed. If we have a view of God that does that to sinners and babies and people who've been predestined to not be saved, then you're going to be like that, more like that. And that's what these guys were like.
Exactly. And they invoke Augustine because Augustine says it's okay to torture heretics. It's better to win your heretics by appealing to them, making these spiritual arguments to them. But if you cannot convert them, the heretics, by appealing to them, then you can convert them by force. You try to do
J.D.
that.
Vance love Augustine?
He does. He talks about him all the time, and so do these guys, right? And a number of other politicians are talking about Augustine, and Augustine's the father of America and the city on a hill and stuff like that.
That's absolute nonsense.
It is. So
they just skip over John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. It's like, yeah, I'm sure I'm stealing your thunder. Keep going.
Yeah. So Calvin, I don't want to be long-winded here, but Calvin's like, people say I shouldn't have killed Servetus, and he's like, I rejoice in the fact that they spit in my face. He's like, let them spit on me. He says, I am persuaded that it is not without the will of God that apart from any verdict of the judges, the criminals have endured protracted torment at the hand of the executioner. It's good to torture criminals. And of course, the idea of hell, you talked about it. It's the same thing. And so if you believe in eternal torment, that God's going to torture you for the sins of a brief lifetime, for eternity, for billions and billions of years, why not burn people at the stake? That's just a prefiguring, right? It's just a prelude to what's going to take place later on. Honor, glory, and riches be the reward for your pains, but above all, do not fail to rid the country of those scoundrels who stir up the people to revolt against us. Such monsters should be exterminated as I have exterminated Michael Servetus, the Spaniard. So he takes credit for it. I killed him. I executed him. So you can't listen to Calvinists who say, oh, no, it was the state. Calvin said, I plotted his destruction. I killed him. And so when you hear about Calvin as the father of America, this is what they want to go back to. The Pope Pius IV, said, the strength of Calvin consisted in this, that money never had the slightest claim for him, the charm for him. If I had such servants, my dominion would extend from sea to sea. So he's like, Calvin didn't care about money. He was a zealot. This is speaking at the commemoration of Calvin. The Pope commemorates Calvin. This is his remarks when Calvin died. And he wanted to execute Calvin. But he's saying he was a zealot. And that's what I liked about him. That was what was good about him. And that's how these guys are as well in the Christian nationalist movement. Now, we want to know, does the U.S. Constitution require a separation of church and state? Or is the U.S. Constitution in favor of a Calvinistic model? And you have this history of revisionism that's taking place. We're going to play just a couple of video clips for you.
I want to just make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page here. So if you go back to the First Amendment, it doesn't say separation of church and state. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But if you go back to the founding time, there were actually a number of states that had formally recognized churches. So there was the Anglican Church of Virginia. That was the official state church of Virginia. Maryland at the time was the only majority Catholic colony, or at least had a significant Catholic representation of the original 13 colonies. There's a lot there. And yes, I do think that what happened is the Supreme Court interpreted Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion to effectively throw the church out of every public space at the federal, state, and local level. I think it was a terrible mistake, and we're still paying for the consequences of it today. But and I think this is your point, if you were to undo that, if you were to get back to a system actually meant by the founders where Congress is not setting up an established religion, but people in their local communities can kind of do whatever it is that they want to do, I think that would be a better system than what we have today.
Fascinating argument, Scott. So,
we could go back and forth on this. Like, Brother Jay, you've got significantly more clips and quotes and founding fathers, don't you?
I do.
Are you available for a part 2? Because we've got another interview scheduled pretty shortly. And I don't want to be like, well, let's try to quick wrap this up in 5 or 10 minutes. What you just brought us on Calvin is just massive historical meat. Can we call that part 1? And are you available Friday? And Brother Jeremiah, are you available to host and produce Friday so we can do a part 2 on this very topic? I want to strike while the iron's hot, not like, when's our next Sunday? You know, like while we're on a roll, can we do this week? I know Brother Jeremiah is more free on Fridays. Is that true? You could pop in if you want, because we'll probably cut this because I think Jay is on board.
Yeah, let's do it.
I do this out of respect for you, Jay, because I want you to really have the time.
No, I appreciate it. And I didn't realize I was going to be so long. I thought I could squeeze it in.
You know what? I'm jumping in. I'm a variable that you can't calculate and plan around. So who knows what I'm going to say and how long I'm going to say it. So I'm gonna pass along to Ginny to cut before you bring that up, and we'll start with this one. And if you want to add more, or do 2 on Friday, Jeremy, can you do Friday? Earth to Jeremy, are you there?